Fight, the recognition. Okay, it is 9 o'clock. We can get started at this point. Very briefly, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Alex Ibe, the Dean of Humanities and Sciences here at Weatherford College. And our speaker today is Daniel Davenport, an adjunct instructor of history here at Weatherford College. And the topic today is going to be the Bowie knife. And I would like to remind our audience that this here is a webinar. We cannot see you and we cannot hear you, so you're muted. But if you want to submit any question or comment, use the chat room to enter your questions, and I will relate that to our speaker as we proceed. Thank you. Now you may proceed.
Thank you, Dr. Ibe. Keep forgetting the camera's up here, not where I can see you. Let me hit the screen share here. PowerPoint. Okay. I hope everyone can see my PowerPoint screen. I want to thank everyone for coming and visiting this online space for this conference so I can humbly give this presentation to you. So, why the Bowie knife? The Bowie knife seems to be a physical manifestation of American frontier culture. There is nothing more American than the Bowie knife. Okay, maybe apple pie, maybe baseball, but if you're not into baseball or apple pie, the Bowie knife definitely says the frontier. Right here you're looking at the traditional Bowie knife as we know it now. This is a Gilhibben Alamo Bowie. And in fact, if you have made your pilgrimage to the Alamo like any good and true Texan should at least once in their life, you have seen this on display at the Alamo as an example of a Bowie knife like they would have carried back then. And incidentally, if you saw the 2003 version of the Alamo, not the John Wayne one, this is the exact knife that Bowie carries in that movie himself. But there are problems with this knife. Not the fact that this knife isn't a sweet, fine-looking collector's item or a good tool, but it did not always look this way. To understand how we get to the knife that we see now, that is the traditional Bowie knife, we have to go back and understand how the Bowie knife may or may not have changed over the years. Because it's a symbol of culture. And as you know, Americans like exporting their culture all over the world. I would like to start by telling you a story. A Western story, a frontier story. A story of a posse. There was a great evil villain, and a posse of good guys comes together to give some frontier justice and kill this villain. They all armed themselves with Winchester 73 repeating rifles, right? The lever actions. Again, a good cowboy gun. They also armed themselves with Bowie knives. And they mount up and give chase to this evil villain. And when they catch up to this evil villain, the Texan of the group, the sole Texan, takes his Bowie knife and stabs the villain in his heart. And as soon as this happens, Dracula ceases to exist and dematerializes. Of course, I am telling you a story directly from the end of Bram Stoker's novel, Dracula. Bram Stoker, if you were a literature person, was an Englishman in the Victorian period who wrote what is kind of known as Gothic horror. But even Bram Stoker could not resist telling a good Western. That's because the English were fascinated with American culture and all things American. But when they thought about American culture, they didn't think of like the city. What they thought about was the frontier. To them, frontier was America. That was what all America was like. In fact, if you talk to some Englishmen today and you will tell them you are from Texas, they will ask you how big your ranch is and how many cattle you have. Which in Weatherford and Parker County, there's a chance you might have some land and maybe some cattle, but most Texans do not have that sort of thing. So we know they're obsessed and have this fascination with American frontier culture. And as material culture goes, right, culture through stuff, the Bowie knife is something that can easily be exported to a foreign country. So everyone knows what Americans carry, at least for their self-defense cutlery. But the thing is, this cultural diffusion goes both ways when it comes to the Bowie knife. It goes both ways because the Bowie knife is actually influenced by the English. And what we know as the Bowie knife is influenced by the English. But before we jump ahead to the end, let's talk about the origins of this famous knife that we all know what this knife looks like. The origins come from James Bowie, or Jim Bowie. Jim Bowie was born in Kentucky in 1796, and he becomes famous in the United States and all around the world. He actually becomes famous several times. There are several events that add to his fame. Of course, we all know that he dies at the Alamo on the 6th of March in 1835, cementing him and his knife as an American legend. Bowie spends most of his life living on the frontier in Louisiana, and then his latter years, really the last about 5-6 years, living in Texas, which of course was even more of a frontier than Louisiana. Bowie was notorious in his life for getting into fights and holding grudges. See, Bowie and his brother Resin, they were not born into wealth. Bowie is what people would call in the past a roguish character. Today we might call him a hustler, always looking to better his position in life, whether socially or financially. He makes most of his money, supposedly as a slave trader. We know when he comes to Texas, he dabbles in the slave trade. May or may not have been involved in the slave trade with the infamous pirate Jean Lafitte. Of course, there are always those rumors that are romantic out there. But in Texas, he's primarily a land speculator and occasionally trades in slaves. Early on in his life, he gains a reputation as a tough guy. Very quick with his temper into violence. And in fact, he is so quick to violence and gets into so many fights. His brother, Resin, gives him a large knife. And you see that in quotes for a reason. Because he knows his brother needs to protect himself. In the early 1800s and even mid-1800s, the most common weapon used for personal defense in the United States is the knife, secondly followed by the gentleman's cane or walking stick or cudgel. This is pretty much because firearms are single-shot affairs at the time, unlike today, where we have a self-contained cartridge. Most pistols are single shot, even rifles and muskets are single shot. And that really doesn't change until the 1850s. So up until the 1850s, 1860s, most people who can't either before firearms become revolvers and cartridge-based carry knives for self-defense. And when you're on the Mississippi, in this frontier, and you like to gamble, and you like to maybe call people liars and get into beefs with other human beings and feuds, you definitely need to be armed. So his brother gives him this large knife, which comes to his aid in one specific act of violence. Before this one specific act of violence, he has a local reputation where he lives. But beyond that, no one knows who he is. Until the Sandbar Fight, which happens after a duel on 19 September 1827. So this is a duel that should not have happened. And the duelists who fight it really did not have a problem with each other or a feud with each other. The reason this duel gets fought is because Jim Bowie has a ongoing feud with a man named Major Norris Wright. The two people who should be having this duel are Major Norris Wright and Bowie. The problem is Major Norris Wright is of a higher social standing in society. And Bowie is perceived as someone in lesser of social standing. Bowie is not as wealthy as Major Norris Wright is. And Bowie also, being involved in the slave trade, is not seen as a gentleman. And in the rules of dueling, which are both written and unwritten at this time and before, only gentlemen can duel. So Norris Wright, seeing Bowie as lesser than him in social standing, is not going to equally challenge or accept a challenge from Bowie. Essentially, their feud starts when Bowie applies for a bank loan. And Major Norris Wright, working at the bank and really owning some controlling shares in the bank, refuses his loan. After this happens, Bowie himself starts openly supporting the candidate that's running against Norris Wright in a local election. And Bowie is popular enough that his word counts where they live. So these are the two men who should be fighting. The two men who end up dueling that day are Samuel Levi Wells III, who is a Bowie supporter, right? He's in Bowie's entourage, so to speak. And a Dr. Thomas Harris Maddox, who is with the entourage of Major Norris Wright. And when the duel happens, the two duelists come out and they bring the entourages. And the duelists don't want to fight, they don't want to die, but they exchange gunfire twice. After this happens, not wanting to push through luck, they shake hands and decide to go home. And this is when a duel that should have been settled and was actually settled devolves into a fight because Major Norris Wright attacks Bowie. Supposedly he shoots at Bowie with the pistol he has. And then after he fires his shot, he takes out his sword cane, which hiding stiletto blades and small swords and canes was very popular back then. And in fact was popular really up until about 1900 in the cities often, and supposedly stabs Bowie. But as Bowie is being stabbed, he takes out the large knife his brother gave him, reaches up, grabs Norris Wright, pulls Norris Wright into his stab with his large knife, and kills Norris Wright. At this point, the fight becomes legendary. Papers pick it up all over the country, and Bowie becomes a household name overnight. He becomes famous, not just regionally because he has a reputation. And in fact, if you go to most places or even small or medium-sized cities and stay there long enough, you'll know some people have a reputation. But Bowie gets this reputation all over this country as this tough guy, frontier fighter, making the knife he carries famous. After this, while Bowie is still alive in his lifetime, the Bowie knife becomes famous. The knife itself. When we talk about what something looks like, the word we use is called typology, right? When we say a thing looks like this and has these specific characteristics. The thing is, we don't exactly know what Bowie's knife looked like that he used at the Sandbar Fight. We're not sure. And in fact, we're not even sure we know what any of the knives Bowie used in his lifetime ever looked like. We are sure of a few things. After the fame of the Sandbar Fight, any large knife starts to be known as a Bowie knife. So, on the frontier, mostly if you carried a large knife, it was something known as a butcher knife. So the knives on the left are fur trade and use butcher knives. Pretty much because the large knife is good for skinning animals and quartering game and processing game. You may notice that these knives look like common kitchen knives and butcher knives that you see even used today. Or The other knife that's also considered a butcher knife that was used on the frontier was called a trade knife. On the right here, you can see actual trade knives from archaeological digs. And pretty much they do look like kitchen knives that you would use today. In fact, the one on the bottom looks an awful lot like a French chef's knife, if you watch a lot of the Food Network like I do and or cook. So these are the kind of large knives that frontiersmen would be carrying in the early 1800s. Yes, frontiersmen do carry small knives and pocket knives. Pocket knives being very popular to do small work with. They also sometimes carry daggers, but a dagger is a completely different animal that we are not concerned with today. The problem with daggers is daggers only serve the one purpose for self-defense, and you're not a multi-purpose knife. Supposedly, Resin Bowie had this knife made up specifically for Jim Bowie. And it was supposed to serve as an all-purpose knife that he could fight with. The problem with many knives and knife fighting is if you fight with something like a butcher knife or something that has no guard for your hands, once your hand and the blade and your handle there starts to get slippery with your enemy's blood, as Bowie would definitely have had enemy's blood on his knife, your hand has a really good chance of slipping off the handle and cutting yourself, which is not good for knife fighting, especially for a knife fighter like Bowie who gets into a lot of fights. So supposedly the original knife was this utility knife and a fighting knife in some way. There's also another problem with the Bowie brothers. During both of their lifetimes, they would give away knives to friends. And of course, we all know that giving gifts is an age-old human thing where anthropologists call it kin selection, and we have friends or we make friends or we cement friendships by giving gifts. So over the years, both brothers give knives away to friends because that's their thing. After Bowie becomes famous for the Sandbar Fight, he is known for his knife. So therefore, if he's going to give a gift, the gift that's going to hold the most meaning for people are knives themselves. After Bowie dies at the Alamo, his brother Resin kind of becomes the keeper of his brother's story. So his brother achieves a level of notoriety and fame, not for anything that he himself did, but for what his brother did. So he's kind of famous as a hangers-on person who knew Bowie. But during this period after the Sandbar Fight until Bowie dies, you've got manufacturers out there who start selling their knives that would have been called butcher knives or trade knives just even a month earlier. But after the fame of this Sandbar Fight happens, everyone who manufactures and sells knives wants to get a piece of that fame, right? They want to associate their product with Bowie and Bowie's knife. And they think, well, if they sell the knife that they're making as a Bowie knife and call it a Bowie knife, people are more likely to buy it. And actually, it kind of works for people and these manufacturers selling these Bowie knives. So this kind of very non-precise language, or I should say a precise name, the Bowie knife, becomes a catch-all term for any large knife. And it's based off of this publicity from Bowie himself. After Bowie dies, resin kind of becomes the keeper of the Bowie legend and legacy. But resin himself isn't a knife manufacturer. At this point in American history, there is not a large dedicated industry of cutlery in the United States. Mostly, if cutlery is made in the United States, it's made by small-time blacksmiths who do not make cutlery solely. They make other things as well. So many of these guys and blacksmiths who are making knives are selling them as one-offs. The cutlery industry that is making a lot of knives at this point is in England. And England, amongst their industrial areas, Sheffield is known for its cutlery industry. So most of the knife makers are in a place called Sheffield, England. And they see an opportunity in the American market. Going towards the Civil War, they are seeing the radicalization of the both sides, the abolitionist side and the side of the slavery supporters. And when you have anyone who is radical and might become violent, there's a market there for selling weapons to. And these cutlery manufacturers in England see this. They also know that Bowie and his knife were famous. So shortly after he dies, they start to make a singular knife type that shares similar characteristics. And they start calling it a Bowie knife, specifically to sell to the American market. And because over 80% of all cutlery in the United States that is sold at this time is from England, there's this big wave of one type of knife coming in. The English are calling it a Bowie knife. So Americans are seeing the majority of these now very large knives that are being sold look the same, and they're being called a Bowie knife. And this is kind of where our modern idea of the Bowie knife typology comes, that shape and form we know very well. Of course, they're selling to an American market that is almost weapon happy leading up to the Civil War. This is actually a warning or an article in an abolitionist's pamphlet called A Slave's Friend from the time period leading up to the Civil War. They are describing the Bowie knife for their general readership here. These horrid weapons are usually called Bowie knives. They were invented by a man who lived in the state of Louisiana. His name was Bowie. It is a French name and is pronounced Bowie. Afterwards, he went to Texas and was killed there in battle. Here's the warning, though, for you abolitionist types. People in slave states often carry such knives about them. When they get angry, they draw the knife and sometimes stab one another. A man who keeps a shop in Broadway, New York, sells Bowie knives. So in the second paragraph, they're warning you about these slavery supporters who are arming themselves. And then in the last sentence, they're telling you exactly where you can get one of these knives to protect yourself from these guys. So if they have a weapon, you need one too. So you need to go get you a Bowie knife. And many of these knives were beautifully etched with sayings like "death to abolition," as you see there. Or in the previous slide, you saw one that said, "Never draw me without reason, nor sheathe me without honor." So Southerners were obsessed with the concept of honor, by the way. That was very popular in the South, that saying right there. Or abolitionists might have ones that are etched with things like "death to traitors," and just buying these beautiful knives that were beautifully decorated and etched from England. And if you're wondering, that's kind of silly to sink all your money into decorating a weapon that you intend to use. Just understand and even think today's arms industry, you can buy say a Glock pistol that is skinned entirely in the American flag. So we even like to decorate our present day weapons that we intend to use. So this is a gorgeous design. Joseph Rogers and Son was one of the original manufacturers from this time period. Here you can see what we consider a classic Bowie knife shape, right? A large, long blade with a clip in it and a flat back. So you have a flat back, but it looks like the kind of the forward piece of the blade is clipped out to give you that kind of very sharp point, and a cross guard on it to protect your hand when you're knife fighting. And it's also kind of in this time period, especially in the 1840s and 50s, there are a lot of knife fighting schools and systems that pop up specifically for Bowie knives, especially in the West and the frontier. Here you have a George Wostenham and Son Bowie knife, again, cross guard, kind of straight handle. Straight backed blade with a clip to the front, and kind of it has a gorgeously semi-embellished sheath for the knife itself. Incidentally, the company, George Wostenham and Son, claims that Bowie himself, Jim Bowie, not resin, gave this specific design to them to start making for him during his lifetime. But somehow they cannot prove it because the original company's records were all destroyed in fire. Actually, company records being destroyed in fire is a quite common thing. So yes, their records probably were destroyed in a fire, but that gives them the opportunity to tell a tall tale that they manufactured the original Bowie knives. So there are claimants to the throne to the original Bowie knives that were carried by Bowie himself. Several knives or knife types, they all claim to be owned by Bowie. So Bowie himself probably owned several knives throughout his lifetime. And it's entirely possible that as he became more, I guess, financially wealthy, you would say, he would upgrade his knives, right? So he might get a better, more beautiful knife, 2 years after 2 years of good business going on for him. And both Bowie brothers probably were like that. So there are many claimants to the throne, and there could have been many knives carried by Bowie, and in fact carried by his brother as well. The first knife claimant to the throne that we are going to talk about here is the James Black knife, known as the Arkansas number 1. There's also the Sea of Mud knife, which purports to be the knife from the Alamo. Then you have a couple of other knife types, the Daniel Searles of Baton Rouge and the Schlively Perkins knife. So this is the James Black knife, number 1 on the left. And on the right, you see what is known as the Sea of Mud knife. The James Black knife, as you can see, looks nothing like the Bowie knife that we know and love today, that's based off the English pattern. It has a straight back, kind of maybe clipped front, and the handle shape is what is called a coffin handle. So these are called coffin handle buoys. And having a coffin handle shape for a personal knife was not uncommon in the 1830s and 40s and even into the 50s. They were very popular. This knife is currently in a museum in Arkansas. James Black was an Arkansas knife maker, blacksmith, not necessarily strictly a knife maker, who supposedly Resin Bowie gave him some specs to create this knife so he could gift it to his brother before the Sandbar Fight. So this purports to be the original knife that Bowie carried, even before the Sandbar Fight. And it was used in the Sandbar Fight to kill Major Morris Wright. So Resin Bowie himself, later in life, after his brother dies, claims that the length of the blade was 9 1/4 inches. Its width 1 1/2 inches, single-edged, not curved. So this kind of looks like that knife that at least he describes. The Sea of Mud knife is really interesting. It was actually found in an archaeological setting with other artifacts on the route of one of the Mexican army columns that was going to San Jacinto. So this is purportedly the Alamo knife. And many people think it is because it has a coffin handle shape and is similar to the James Black knife. This is the Daniel Searles knife. He was a cutler in Baton Rouge in Louisiana. It is known that Resin Bowie bought several Searles knives later on after James Bowie died. And he was known to gift these knives out and maybe even owned one himself. This is the Schlively Perkins knife, given as a gift by Resin Bowie. And it kind of closely fits the description of Resin's description of the original knife, given as a gift after his brother's death. Problems with knife authentication, or at least in general and or with the Bowie knife. Most knives from established makers, people who are making a lot of knives in the 1800s, have known maker's marks, and all their knives are cataloged. So they will make a type of knife, a specific knife, over and over and over. They'll catalog what the knife looks like. They'll catalog the maker's mark on that knife. And we know from looking at these catalogs, we can type and date a knife specifically. Most U.S. blacksmiths who are not making these, cataloged one type of knives and selling it over and over to many people, they don't have catalogs for their knives so we can date them or type them or even really see what blacksmith made them. Very few blacksmiths made knives enough for them to do that or even put maker's marks on them. Many of the U.S. knives that or purported to be Bowie knives from that era. A lot of these curators and authenticators says, this knife looks like this knife that we know was made by this guy. So I believe this is the knife that Bowie carried because it's similar to a knife that was owned by Resin Bowie or gifted by Bowie to someone else later in life. There's also another problem with knife authentication: fakes. The fame of the knife causes a lot of modern day fakes to be made. On the left there, you can see Phil Collins. You may or may not recognize him as the front man of the band Genesis. Being the front man of the band Genesis has, of course, made him a multimillionaire over his lifetime. So he has money to collect things. And one of the things he collects is Alamo artifacts. He is a huge Alamo fan and history fan. He is there holding a knife that he bought that is purported to be one of the knives that Bowie owned or was gifted by Bowie to someone else. The problem is, this looks an awful lot like the Bowie knives that came based off the English design. So American manufacturers in the 1900s, specifically like the 1950s and later, start making these knives. In fact, that would almost be a dead knockoff of the Gil Hibben knife, the Alamo Bowie that you saw at the beginning of this presentation. The thing is, you really cannot date knives. There's no test to date specifically a knife, a scientific test. So therefore, people who make fakes, there are certain techniques that they can do to patina the blade to make it look like an antique, and then, you know, sell it to Phil Collins for probably $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. So let's do the takeaways here. The takeaways: we do not know what the original knife or knives that Bowie carried looked like. We do know that after the Sandbar Fight, the term Bowie knife was used to describe any large knife. After the Alamo, English manufacturers began making knives that share the same characteristics. And this is what becomes our modern Bowie knife, where we get our understanding of our modern Bowie knife. There are many claimants to the original knife or knives, but the problems with the provenience means that we'll never know for sure. And we're pretty much sure that Phil Collins got ripped off on his Bowie knife purchase, but he gave it to the San Jacinto Museum, and you will see it in the San Jacinto Museum, and they present it as a knife from that time period as one of the original Bowie knives. Any questions? Okay.
That's a wonderful, wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ebe.
Yeah, now we urge our participants, they can send in their questions, comments.
Yes, Denise. Unfortunately, the Bowie knife does not look like a Gil Hibben Alamo Bowie. The original knife looks probably something more like a butcher's knife. How much? Do you mean what Phil Collins paid for his? Or how much Bowie knives from the time period are the antiques? So Phil Collins probably paid something like between $20,000 and $40,000 for that knife, because Supposedly the provenience was there from, you know, someone, the family passed it down and their ancestor was at the Battle of San Jacinto or at the Alamo, something like that. Just English Bowie knives from the era, from like 1835 to the 1850s, 60s. Those knives will run you anywhere, if they're in really good condition, $1,000 to $3,000, depending on the condition. So if you're into knives, you can do that, or you can buy a brand new Alamo Bowie from Gil Hibben for about $1,200 if you're into knife collecting. So yeah, if you go down the knife rabbit hole, you can spend a lot of money, even for modern knives that are handmade. Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed presenting.
Yeah. How many of these knives are in circulation? Do you know?
In circulation, the English Bowies or the authentic ones from the 1830s?
The authentic.
There are actually a lot of authentic Bowie knives from that time period in circulation, because any big knife was labeled a Bowie knife back then. So any big knife, they're going to say this is a Bowie from, you know, the 1820s or the 1830s, because all knives were labeled Bowie knives, or at least all big ones that weren't daggers.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Do I have any antique knives myself? I do have some more modern knives that you could consider antiques that are from like World War II. Mm-hmm. I do have a rather large knife collection, to include handmade knives. Several years ago, I went and learned how to make knives from a master knifesmith named Dan Harrison, who is sadly passed on now. And he, in fact, made many English-style Bowie knives for hunters and collectors. And a lot of people, Cashline, claim to have been the original Bowie knife makers. And maybe they were, maybe they weren't. Because when you account into like resin and Jim Bowie, they would buy knives and gift to people. So any knifesmith that made a knife for them at one point could claim to have made a knife that could have been Bowie's personal knife. Okay.
Any more questions? Well, if there are no more questions, I think we can wrap this up. Again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you to Daniel for a job well done. Thank you all. See you next time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.